It's a delight really to be ending the semester today in this lecture series, the Interdisciplinary lecture series of the Center for Translation Studies, with a lecture by a very, very good colleague, Amina Elbendary. Amina is Associate Professor of History in the Department of Arab and Islamic Civilizations, and she is one of the most dynamic forces in this department. Truly. She is the co-organizer of the annual history seminar in the department that brings together young scholars from Egypt and the Arab world. She is also a board member of the Women in Memory Forum, and she is the co-organizer of ARIC's Ahwa and Kalem, which is another wonderful sort of brown bag lunch series that is held on a monthly basis.
Yes,
yeah, with a great following. Amina's research is focused on Arab Islamic historiography, Islamic political thought, medieval and early modern popular culture, and gender history. Her much awaited book has recently been published by AUC Press, and it is entitled Crowds and the Sultan, Urban Protest in Late Medieval Egypt and Syria, and it deals with urban popular revolts in Mamluk cities, Cairo, Damascus, and Aleppo. Her talk this afternoon is entitled The Historian as Translator, Problems, Challenges, and Possibilities. Please help me welcome Amina and thank her for this
Thank you very much, Samia. Thank you for inviting me here today. Thank you all for coming, indeed, on the last day of classes. And Samia had told me this was a bit of an informal discussion, or we could hope for this to be a bit of an informal discussion. So I've jotted down some ideas that I hope will perhaps push us into a conversation and the debate. On issues of making history and making history as being itself an act of translation. I think this is the main theme that I would like to throw out to you today, to what extent making history of any sort is in itself an act of translation. Now, of course, these issues do not only relate, that I will be discussing today, do not only relate to Arab history or Islamic history, or Middle Eastern history, although, of course, naturally my examples will mainly be out of my own experience of studying and teaching here. But this is a wider debate, and at one level, any reading of the past, I argue, is an act of translation. In a famous book by David Lowenthal, he has argued that the past is a foreign country. Now, the title of the book is itself taken from a novel by L.P. Hartley, a 1970 novel called The Go-Between. And that novel begins with the phrase that the past is a foreign country, they do things differently there. And in his book on the past as a foreign country, Lowenthal deals with issues of memory and history together, including such questions as why and how we change what has come down to us, to what ends its vestiges, like our memories, are salvaged or contrived, and how these alterations affect our heritage and ourselves. And he seeks to show how the past, once virtually indistinguishable from the present, has become an ever more foreign realm, yet one increasingly suffused by the present. So this is really a modern position on the past. Other societies, and to an extent up to now in many parts of Arab Muslim societies, do not imagine this very sharp separation between the past and the present. Now, I happen to find that there is a separation, and I find it interesting, if sometimes also vexing, that not everybody sees things the way I do, and that many people speak and think and imagine societies like 7th century Medina, for instance, as extensions of our own. The idea of the foreignness of the past, its distance from us, its alienness, it itself best exemplifies one of the main constraints of historiography when we compare it to other disciplines, or what is sometimes referred to as its epistemological fragility. Now, unlike people who work in other disciplines, unlike other scholars, those of us who study the past don't really have the luxury of going back and experiencing it firsthand. so we can't touch it, and we can't go to a lab and play around with the past and put it differently and reorganize it differently. Like visitors to foreign countries who are forced with the necessity of dealing with a language other than their own, visitors to the past also have to deal with those barriers and to translate between different times and places, between the experiences of past people and our own. I think I'll sit down. And I find this idea best expressed in a paragraph from Arundhati Roy's first novel. And Maggie and I will remember our excitement at reading it when it first came out, a zillion years ago, The God of Small Things. She writes, he explained to them that history was like an old house at night, with all the lamps lit, and ancestors whispering inside. To understand history, Chaco said, we have to go inside and listen to what they're saying, and look at the books and the pictures on the wall, and smell the smells. But we can't go in, Chaco explained, because we've been locked out. And when we look in through the windows, all we see are shadows. And when we try to listen, all we hear is a whispering. And I think this, in many ways, best explains part of our dilemma, that we are locked out as historians or as students of the past, and we can't really hear very well what was going on inside this house. We need to somehow translate it into terms that are familiar to us. Now, in translation studies, on the other hand, and as I keep learning from Samia's lectures, one of the recurring debates goes around the issue of loyalty to the text and the authenticity of translation. And one position in this debate is that every act of translation involves a betrayal to the original text, translator, traitor, because the translator inevitably brings herself into the act of translation, looks through her lenses to render, in other words, the original text. The question of the visibility and the invisibility of the translator has been discussed, of course, by many scholars, including Lawrence Venuti, in The Translator's Invisibility. Now, writing about the past, I think, is also, or it involves a similar act of betrayal, hence of translation. The historian, too, is by necessity a traitor. And the debate that the translator has on domestication versus foreignization is one that she shares with the historian and the student of the past. How are we to imagine and render the past? Do we stress how foreign and different it is from us, its people were from us? Do we stress how familiar it is? How our ancestors loved their children too? And then, in addition to all those questions, we're faced by other challenges, such as terminology. And here I will step back and give you some examples from my own experience. And this is a story that stays with me up until today, so bear with me. It was my very first day at AUC, that was in the 1990s, and it was my first class, and it was 10 o'clock in the morning. And it was a class on the history of Greece and Rome, History 203 with David Blanks. And David told us that he had just arrived to Cairo 2 weeks before. And he began introducing the material, and he told us, we won't discuss ancient Egypt and ancient Mesopotamia because you must know all about this already. Now, I confess to you that all my fears, all my anxieties, all the insecurities of coming to college and coming to AUC, everything was up here in my throat. What on earth was he talking about? That I must know all about already. Ancient Egypt? Yes, maybe, perhaps. But what is Mesopotamia? And I panicked. I was lost in Mesopotamia and in translation. Bout of tears after class in the bathroom in the Jamil Center, and then I decided I must be an adult and take charge. And my mom always used to tell me that was her standard answer to many questions, perhaps things that she didn't want to tell me about herself, but her standard answer was, go look it up. So go I did to the library, and that was the main library, the great campus on Muhammad Mahmud Street. Unfortunately, I couldn't get to the interior of the library. I failed, but you can imagine. Now, when you walked into this massive, intimidating building on Muhammad Mahmoud Street, there was a big foyer, big reception on the ground floor of the library. There was something called the card catalog, which included cards that listed all the books in the library. And there was a huge, humongous dictionary that was too heavy to be held in one's hand, and it stood in the middle, in the foyer, as far as I remember, on a big table. So right there, I went to that, and I checked the big dictionary under Mesopotamia, and there it said something like the land between the rivers. And then suddenly it hit me. I might not know what Mesopotamia was, but the land between two rivers rang a bell. That must be Bilad al-Rafidain. Okay, I knew something about that. That rang a bell. This was only the first of many such moments when I came to learn about my history as an Egyptian, as an Arab, as a Muslim, in translation. I came to read texts written in English, sometimes in French, about that history with which I was expected to be familiar, but in a language other than my own. Reading, learning, later writing, teaching this history in translation has been both a challenge and an opportunity. A challenge because it is jarring at times. It hits you, kind of like looking at yourself in a distorted mirror. An opportunity because it lets you see things that might not be discernible at first view. So for a while, like any other annoying student, I reveled in pedantic issues, like how jihad is not holy war and the ulama are not a clergy. We are not them. And indeed, there is a trend within our field, within Arabic studies and Islamic studies, which stresses the exceptionality of our area, of our experience, even exoticizes it, and so places much of those terms and experiences in italics. So a lot of our texts, when you look at them, there's a lot of italics there to emphasize this exceptionality. But beyond the surface level, I also eventually came to see other challenges involved than the obvious trap of creating inaccurate analogies or reducing sophisticated historical experiences to other, more familiar ones, and ones born out of other people's experiences. Those issues continue to come up in teaching. So students often report a certain discomfort upon reading about their history in another language. Invariably, not because of the language per se, but rather because of the discourse. And again, this was something we were just talking about half an hour ago in class, that there is something that bothers one. Scholars writing in English or French about Arab and Islamic history typically are products of modern, occasionally postmodern, secular intellectual traditions, and their approaches to the field are removed from those of Arab and Muslim discourse. Now, one example that comes to mind is how we deal with the conquests and how conquest as a term might help explain something like the Futuhat, for instance. So this is one term that remains perplexing for students of Arab history, the Futuhat. From the root fataha, to open, the Futuhat can be said to have been a process of wars and treaties, of conquest and accommodation, by which the Arabs came to rule a big chunk of the Eastern Mediterranean in the 7th and 8th centuries. The term in Arabic has been used to refer to other advances in the region, but not all. So some sources will speak of al-Futuhat al-Islamiyya to refer to the 7th century conquests, and al-Fath al-Uthmani, for instance, to speak of the expansion of the Ottomans later on. And the Abbasid writer, for instance, al-Baladurri, writes of Futuh al-Buldain. Now, in Arabic, fataha has various connotations, generally positive ones, although one could also read it as a sexualized term. Some historians have objected to its use in Arabic, calling for the use of other words such as ghazw, for instance, especially in reference to the Ottoman expansion. So for instance, I recall our colleague and Professor Imad Abu always makes it a point when referring to the coming of the Ottomans in the 16th century to call it al-Ghazw al-Uthmani. But ghazw also carries with it connotations of raiding, especially by nomadic groups. So it might not be a very accurate term to use when we're discussing advances by an organized imperial army such as the Ottomans. Would it be more suited for the 7th century advances then? Or would it downplay the achievement of the early Arabs, ignore the organization and perhaps the intentionality of their feats? what is the correct term to use in Arabic to explain this historical experience? And then what about other languages? It's not an easily translated language or term. In English and modern European and Anglophone historians typically refer to the 7th century advances as conquests. So, more recent books. Okay, stuck. It's okay. So Hugh Kennedy's more recent books, for instance, speaks of the next one, yes, the Great Arab Conquests, how the spread of Islam changed the world we live in. Now, growing up with a term like Futuhat, I hadn't really stopped to think about its connotations. One doesn't stop to think about words that are so common, but then reading it in English, reading about it in English forces one, or in another language, any other language, forces you to think about its multiple meanings. And then having to translate material that relates to this from the primary sources then forces you to think of how to interpret it, regardless of whether you're going to be writing about it in English or in Arabic. Now, part of my own training, most of my training happened in universities like the American University or else later on in Cambridge. So I was studying Oriental studies and Arabic studies in Anglophone universities, and these are departments and disciplines that were meant to train non-native speakers mainly about the history and the tradition of the region. And these disciplines and their graduate programs have a very strong philological basis. So part of the training of students is to make sure that they can understand the texts and they can read the language, the original language for themselves. So there's a lot of emphasis on this. And in training us, there's a lot of emphasis on translation. So one of the skills that we are being taught is how to read the primary sources in the original language and then translate it into another language. And at first, this was, again, one of those annoying things that one had to go through. For me, at least, it was very annoying. And I felt, okay, this is something really for the khawagate, because they don't know the Arabic. This is something for the others to worry about. Why are they obsessing about me producing primary texts in English? I know my Arabic already. Little did I know. And there is still this resistance, but of course with time I found the exercise to be very useful because it forces you to interpret, to really think about whether you understand the terms in Arabic. You really understand the material that you're reading and what it means. Now, one example, more recent example for me, came up with how to write about the Amma. So in my book that Professor Mehriz referred to, I deal with popular protests in late medieval Egypt and Syria in the pre-modern period. And I came to experience this challenge of how to understand the past in its different junctures. Of course, there are various obstacles. To begin with, in imagining periods that are far removed from us. So really anything before the modern period is very difficult to imagine. We don't have photographs, for instance, to go to, or films to watch, or even people to speak to, and just have conversations with and ask them, how were you cooking your meals, and how were you serving dinner at table, and who sat next to whom, and things like that. How did you walk down the streets? What did you wear at home, and what did you wear out on the street? We don't have access to this type of material. So on the level of everyday life. But it also, this challenge, this obstacle in trying to reconstruct the past also applies to big issues as well. Now, we try to use what survives. We try to use narratives. We try to use artifacts. And to connect whatever traces remain to us. But always, inevitably, we're doing this through a matrix of imagination. We place whatever traces we have in a matrix of our own making to make sense of those issues. So even when we are trying to imagine a bird's eye view of these societies, such as what were ruling structures really like in the pre-modern period? What was government under the Romans? We speak of government, but what is government? Can we speak of the state in the pre-modern period? How can we imagine a pre-class society? Now I came across these obstacles again and again, especially in dealing with popular protests, as I was mentioning to you, and in dealing with the Amma. And this is a word that comes up frequently in the sources, in the text. It's not a strange word. The authors do not stop to define it. It seems self-evident, to them at least. But then any reader of these sources will realize that, again, like many words in our vocabulary, it means one thing in one place and it means another thing in another context. So when we speak of وقامة العامة, when our sources say وقامة العامة, they mean one thing. And when in another section they say العامي لا يحتسب, they mean another thing. I tended to translate this term as commerce because I felt, okay, there are similar connotations between the amma in reference to groups of people, in reference to the masses, and the word commoners. Sometimes I use non-elites. I feel that the amma in the original language are usually undifferentiated masses. They're distinguishable from the khassa, who are distinguished, who are closer to the elite. They are the opposite of the khassa. Sometimes they are the lay people, so they are the opposite of the ulama, who are somehow holders of a specialized elite knowledge. They're easier to define in negative terms, so I can tell you what the amma are not. So they are not the Mamluks, and they are not the khassa. They are not necessarily uneducated, although some of them might be. They're not necessarily poor. They could provide for themselves at least. One thing I did is to go to some contemporary sources like the Mamluk historian Maqrizi and to see how he looked at society, how he understood his own contemporary society. And there I found he discusses in one book, in Ighathat al-Ummah, he discusses 7 groups of people in society, or rather 7 estates. The first were the rulers, those who hold the reins of power. The second, the rich merchants and the wealthy who lead a life of affluence. The third, the retailers, who are merchants of average means, such as the cloth merchants, he tells us. This also includes small shopkeepers. Then the peasants, who cultivate and plow the land. They are the inhabitants of villages and of the countryside. The fifth category are those who receive a stipend, the fuqara, and it includes the ulama, students of theology, the ajnad of the halaqa in the army, etc. The sixth category are the artisans and the salaried persons who have a skill, so skilled labor. And the seventh are the needy and the paupers, the beggars who live off the charity of others. So in Maqrizi's own viewpoint, wealth alone was not the main marker of difference amongst people in society. He offers a quasi-hierarchical structure that begins with the rulers on the top and the beggars at the bottom, but in the middle are various categories of people who are distinguished by their roles in society, by the functions they perform thereof. And I imagined that the Amma lived among those various layers, somewhere between 2 and 5, in the middle, but being part of all of those as well. So I ended up using things like common people, terms such as common people and the non-elite. It's not ideal, I understand. It's meant to convey to the reader that sorts of individuals who are not formally part of the ruling structure, but who came to play roles in society in matters of power and politics, who did protest and who did negotiate power with the rulers and with those in charge. These are people, I imagine, who included craftsmen and artisans and tradesmen, small-scale merchants, minor clerks and employees of the awqaf, katibs, janitors, muazzins, copyists, people who were traditionally marginalized and undifferentiated in classical historiography, and yet who come up again and again on the pages of the chronicles and other sources that I've been using. So to go back again to my original point earlier today, I argue that since reading primary sources is in itself an act of interpretation, it is also an act of translation. In trying to understand the past and in trying to understand primary sources that survive to us from the past, we are invariably in a process of translation. Understanding the past is a process of interpretation and of considerable imagination. That is in many ways an attempt to bring that past closer to the terms we understand in the present, even as we strive to remain faithful to the historical experiences. We are, like the translators, caught between the polar ends of domestication and foreignization. The challenge is perhaps most flagrant in attempts at popular history, and this is the last examples that I'd like to finish with. So we get many times in historical drama attempts to use the past simply as a setting to say things about the present. Most historians, professional historians or academic historians, are aware of this pitfall, and this is not what we are trying to do in writing about the past and imagining it. We are consciously trying to avoid it. We see ourselves probably at the other end of the spectrum. At the very farthest end is probably the antiquarian, the person who is so obsessed with things past and ancient that they lose the forest for the trees. Now, it's easier to find examples of the first, of people who use the past as a setting. So, for instance, some of films, historical films, such as Nasser Salah ad-Din. Now, I don't know how many of you have watched Nasser Salah ad-Din, but it's a good example, and Professor Ghazul will remember that Hala Halim has a very interesting article on Nasser Salah ad-Din in one of the issues of Alif. It's an interesting example, really, of how a historical figure, historical character, very much a real historical figure, who is Salah ad-Din, was represented as Nasser Salah ad-Din by Yusuf Shaheen in 1963, and reimagined almost in a way that fit with the requirements or with the needs of the time in the 1960s. Characters, even aside from the references to Nasser in the Arabic title of the film, it is interesting to see how the characters move in speaking, in their dialogue from modern standard Arabic to colloquial Arabic. Sometimes in the film they make statements that would make the historian shudder. So they say things like "Ad-Din lillah wal watan lil jami'." I mean, there is no way that Salah ad-Din. Okay, we're using our imagination, and there's a lot that we don't know about dialogue in the 12th century. But there is no way that they would have sat there together speaking of "Ad-Din lillah" and "Al watan lil jami'." This is that foreign. Similarly, for instance, in another film that I'd worked on for my MA, Wa Islameh deals with the historical characters of Qutuz and Baybars. And to watch the film, Qutuz and Baybars are practically Ulad al-Girain, they are imagined in very familiar terms, and things, historical precedents that are uncomfortable, such as the fact that this very lovely Ibn al-Girain, Rushdi Abaza, ends up killing the lovelier Ibn al-Girain, Ahmad Mazhar, something that is, glossed over, and we find the way to, relieve them of the blame. So it's interesting. What do you do? How far should you go in familiarizing the past and making it? Okay, it didn't happen. My last example is also a funny one. Is Yusuf Shaheen's feature on Ibn Rushd al-Masir, which was produced in 1997. Now, it's baffling in a way. It's an interesting film, it's an entertaining film, but all the singing and dancing is, perhaps unexpected. If a historian were to write a history of Ibn Rushd, the singing and the dancing is probably not the first thing that we would imagine, and yet that was important in 1997 for Yusuf Shaheen in the way he imagined Ibn Rushd, almost perhaps in his own image. Perhaps, for him, Ibn Rushd becomes the artist rather than the philosopher, the intellectual artist who stands up for values that Shaheen himself wanted to defend in 1997 against what he perceived as extremist religious ideas. So here was an example from the past that could be pushed to the fore and made to say things that Shaheen himself wants to say. Was this translation less faithful than others? Probably. Are all histories of Ibn Rushd by necessity translations, even ones done by academic historians? Yes. Is there a difference between them? Is one translation, dare I say, better than the other? I would say yes, there is a difference. in the end, despite the enormous amounts of imagination that we bring to our work, there is also a certain commitment to authenticity and commitment to the past as much as possible that we carry with us as we do this act of translation. So I don't know about you, how the rest of you feel about those issues, what your opinions are, and what examples perhaps that you have in your own work that you would like to share with us.
Thank you for a very challenging and thought-provoking lecture. I'm sure people have a lot of questions. But then,
I have many questions. This is a very engaging talk. But one thing, the idea of treason. The whole idea of treason, you cannot justify the term unless you think there is what you call authentic or real or actual and so on. But also you tell us from Arundhati Roy that we are locked out of it. Okay? So if we're not talking about something that, you know, concrete that you can touch and say this is the real thing, then the whole idea of treason doesn't really work, as far as I'm concerned. I think what we can call it is guesswork, but intelligent guesswork, logical research and so on, but I don't think the idea of treason is there. But let me just add to this. As translator of history, you talked about translating, how you translate into English, like Futuhat. Of course, Futuhat is also used by Ibn Arabi,
Yes,
Makkiyah,
yes.
as revelation and so on. But what I want to say is, you also touched on something that's very interesting, that even when you read in primary text, and this is your language, and you know your
Yes.
Arabic inside out and so on, you are still
Then translate.
interpreting.
Yes.
Now, this is what I want to refer to, this interpretation of works that you really understand the language and you are still interpreting. Now, we never interpret in a vacuum. We always have a worldview.
Yeah.
So how would you then add to this the idea of historiography? You know, if you are, for example, a disciple of Vico or Ibn Khaldun or whatever, you know, people have talked about the philosophy of history. How does this come in interpreting the primary text? And also, where do you stand in terms of history? I mean, how do you see history? Is it something developing towards something better? Or is it something repeating itself? Or is it maybe something developing into something very bad, you know, worse?
as we can well see.
I think my generation has been trained away from those meta-narratives of either progress or decline. Cycles in their abstract sense are attractive, but even that is a bit of a meta-narrative that we tend to stay away from, I would say. We try to break down pieces and try to hold on to as many of the traces as possible. I realize, I mean, in a way I'm a product of that generation, but I realize now, in retrospect, the limitations of it. So I think I too am going back to a big picture and of trying to imagine a wider view of how things are. Certainly, I don't think that history is fiction. I don't think that we're making it all up, but I realize the limitations there. And certainly I realize that the reader, the interpreter, their background, what their generation and their philosophy, etc., brings something into whatever it is they're interpreting, into even things such as what you decide to ignore, what doesn't stand out, and I mean, there are multiple examples. We all come across this. You bring in, even in class, you bring in a short text to the students because you want to show them one thing and I mean, this happened again a few weeks ago. I wanted to show them something about the Conquests and they stopped at the story about the sword of مش عارفة مين and the multiple names of the swords. And you know, it's important, but I was not interested in it. You know, I mean, why? Who cares that there are 10 names to the sword and who inherited this sword from whom? But they you know, they stop at this. So we are locked out, but we hear the echoes. I think this is also one reason why the Roy quote is one that I go back to, is is that there are echoes and there are people in there, and we know that. We're not just imagining that there are people in the house or imagining all the conversation. But I think with most of us have moved from big stories or big narratives of progress and decline, history as moving in a certain direction, in one certain direction. I'm not sure if I've answered you.
It's a big problem.
Yeah.
I mean, you've touched on a very big issue. I mean, this is a little bit off the subject of translation and more into the subject of history. But is history only the little details of what happened and who ate what and who sat next to what? No. You can't separate history from the bigger narrative. I mean, the detailed, concrete issue that you refer does not really have a meaning if you don't put it in a bigger picture. So why this separation?
Yeah, but the problem that we face is what you begin
what
with
you call
first.
the meta-narrative, which includes one or two things, but the world is much bigger than that. I mean, it's a world view rather than decline and progress. No, we don't believe in progress. We can see it in our own lives. But we also know that the detail of who is sitting next to who is not all that important either. So if it's not Aziza, maybe it's Ferial, so fine. I mean, what does it change? The little detail is not everything.
No, it's not
And if you stick
everything,
to
but
that,
if you
you
think
miss-
of it as building blocks, as maybe bricks in something that you are building, what comes first? Is it the bricks that you put together to build something?
Are they separate?
Or are you imagining a house and then you're
Are they
trying to-
separate things?
No, they're
Is
not.
that one thing and that's another? Or are they,
Discursively, they are not,
yeah?
which is, which
It's what
is
we
the-
hope to do, is to see some sense between a bigger picture and the concrete manifestation. I mean, it's a big problem among these people.
And as I said, I want to go back to the example of Yusuf Shaheen or Ibn Rushd and how you sort of eloquently represented the film as a sort of representation of Hussein himself rather than Ibn Rushd.
a possible reading of the film.
I want to sort of look at your work in that light. Given that your book has sort of matured over the past 4 years, basically, in a context that is identical, I mean, it really is a moment of protest, of crowds, of the Sultan in the present, and how the present, therefore, influenced the focus of your work, but also your translation of that moment in the past for us.
I think you're very right in that certainly the context of writing and of working on this material must have influenced it. Of course, the book that Dr. Mehriz is referring to, Unpopular Protest, was the basis of my dissertation, or was based on my dissertation, and this is something that I began working on in 2004, so quite a long time before 2011. So, I mean, there is a process of my self-learning as a student and working on the book, and then there is the process of me as an individual, firstly writing about this in England, and then coming here and experiencing the events and the revolution, etc. I think one definite outcome is the breakdown of a romantic perception of the crowds. And even as a student, I spoke of the need to not to romanticize the crowds. I think that unconsciously in my dissertation I was doing part of that, romanticizing crowds and crowd movements and popular protest in the pre-modern period. And I think that the experiences of 2011 and what happened afterwards perhaps helped me deflate some of that romanticism a bit, but also humbled me in the way I was approaching pre-modern protest. Because even if I wasn't consciously saying it, there is an implication in the study of pre-modern protest that somehow it wasn't enough. Pre-modern protest typically did not reach the level of revolution. I mean, revolution is itself a modern historical development in the sense that we understand it, or in the sense that we use the term. And somehow the pre-modern popular protests are something sub-revolution, sub that sort of comprehensive change. And when you work on it a lot, you might somehow be disappointed that the bar was so low. And even if it doesn't come out in those terms while one is writing. I think that the experiences of 2011 and what happened afterwards have humbled me in that respect. That is, they have made me appreciate in a different way what it means to speak truth to the Sultan, regardless of the context and of the situation, have added more meaning to what it means to be out on the street. And in reference to lack or deflating romanticism, has also helped me better appreciate what negotiation was about. So I started out looking for protests, and I ended up finding more negotiation than violent rioting. And I think that in large part, due to the experiences of the last few years, I've come to appreciate negotiation more, and to appreciate also the outcome of negotiation, and the outcome of small gains, if you will, pushing against the boundaries and barriers, and winning some space over. I've come to appreciate also what it means to be more involved in public space, for instance, and to have a voice in public space, and not to take that for granted, and to remember also that historically populations have been pushing that barrier for centuries. And also having experienced how easily this could be lost, I have perhaps a better appreciation of even the small gains and winnings of pre-modern period.
You say that the little, like, why are the little details important to a historian? What do you think? Is it because it's an attempt to bring us closer to the past, even though you say that's the danger and that we should divorce sort of the past from the present? And also, what about the word, like when you're translating history, what about the words that you have to get them from context? Isn't context often subject to like your subjective interpretation? So like then you're stuck, like you have to do something.
Well, you might be stuck, yes. You might be stuck. Because sometimes also you don't find what you want to find in the context. Yeah. That is, ideally you will find terms used by more than one author in more than one work, or you will find some representation or an artifact that refers to something, so you can visualize it and compare it to something that you read somewhere else. And sometimes you don't, and you can, walk down paths without really knowing whether this is true. I think the little details are sometimes important because they humanize the past. So maybe not in and of themselves, as Dr. Hanna was arguing, but they help you relate as a human being to people who lived before. So even on that level, they help you connect. But again, one needs to move a bit further.
But you just said something right now about how sometimes you don't find what you're looking for. So from your experience, would you say that you go into like an investigation or something, trying to find something specific, or just in general? Like how would you approach research or anything?
You start with a general question, with general questions, I think. Keeping in mind that your questions will change as you go along. You have perhaps an area that you're interested in, or a theme or a topic, but as you work in the sources, within the sources, you will find that they are taking you somewhere. And you need to be flexible enough to sharpen these questions as you go along and to ask new ones. So I started out, for instance, with a stupid question, really, now in retrospect, which was, why is it that Egyptians never revolt? You know, this had to be ditched, you know, even in that, you know, you couldn't just ask that question anymore.
Yeah. Actually, one thing that occurred to me as we were, this term "little details" has come up a number of times, and I just, in response to your question, it occurred to me when you start out, you have assumptions about the things that are big and the things that are small, right? But the reality is that if you appreciate the past as foreign, as having had very different values and worldviews from what we have today, you also may discover along the way that what you thought was little was very, very big,
Yes.
right? And vice versa.
Yes.
I mean, even Dr. Hanna's point about, well, it may not make any difference to us today who's sitting next to each other, but 200 years ago in this same setting, it may have been the case that people coming into the room would have taken particular places at the table
Yes.
according to their social rank or some other criterion that we don't even imagine today.
Yes.
So I think we have to, as you suggested, we have to approach these texts with enormous humility, because we come with our questions, but in the reading of the text, it is a recursive process, as you're suggesting. As you go back to the text again and again, things begin to emerge, and things that you thought were little details at the first may end up being enormously important and enormously helpful also in understanding the situation.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, certainly.
So the names of these swords may turn out to be more.
Adam,
If we have time, so I don't know if anyway, I just want to say thank you very much, and I really appreciate that you made a point for translating historical primary sources, etc. Because my students don't like doing it, but it is really the only way of demonstrating comprehension. Right? I mean, I'm convinced that there's no other way for me to test when a student
yeah, it's
understands.
one of the ways,
I find it the most comprehensive way of demonstrating comprehension. And even for myself, I mean, I can pretend that I understand text, but when I sit down and translate them, then I'm really confronted with the gap between me and it, right? So I believe in it. It's very difficult and time consuming, but I think it's worth it. But you said something which was really quite funny, because you said that there's public history, or there's history for the public, and there's what we do as academic historians, and we're not meant to be writing. We're not meant to allow the present to inform the purpose of our history.
No, I didn't say that. But we try, we don't mean to use the past as a setting for what we want, consciously.
Yeah.
Certainly, of course, I have something to say about the present by writing about protests.
Yeah.
Yes, of course, but it's not that I had something to say about protests, so I went around and was looking for a historical precedent that I can use,
Right. Okay, yeah, but I mean, that would also be legitimate, I think, right? I mean, it's not, I don't think that there's not a place for academic history that does that either, right? I mean, you see what I mean?
Yeah, I see what you
were
mean,
saying
so I'm
the
not sure
question
if I
that you
agree.
asked, the question you asked is informed by your present context. Right?
Yes,
So the question,
but it's not the same as Shaheen, I'm sorry. I wish I would be as popular. I wish I would be as popular.
No, but let's say it's not the same as Shaheen, but I mean, is it, what I'm saying is cognitively, I think it's impossible for it not to be like what Shaheen does, right? I mean, cognitively, I don't see how me as a researcher can actually step out of my own head and ask a question in a sort of, let's say, hermeneutic way that is not determined by my experience.
Maybe it's a matter of how the level at which you do that. I mean, Shaheen was very flagrant maybe in the studying of it. But maybe as a historian you do that, but you're aware and you're conscious that you're trying not to do it.
That's what historians think.
Of
They're
course.
aware, and that's a fallacy.
But I mean, because the funny thing about our tradition, I mean, this tradition is like the most, elaborated tradition, or the historiography of the Islamic tradition is the most elaborated one. So we don't really have anything. I mean, what we're talking about is already their imagination of what happened, right? So why not just have our own imagination of their imagination of what happened? Why don't we frank about it? I mean, you see what I mean?
because then, you know, they're fabulated.
With
It's not
limitations,
historians.
yeah.
Yeah,
With limitations.
of course, yeah.
And the limitations are, you know, the building blocks we hold on to, the echoes, yeah.
Here, one last thing that I want to say about, you know, the terms, because you talk so much about terminology, as if, you know, these are fixed. And I want to suggest that they're
لا, I
very
wouldn't
fluid,
want-
they're very,
of course.
and that reading the word Futuhat
صحيح.
2 centuries
Definitely.
ago is very different from
Oh, yes.
reading the word Futuhat. And in translation, what conquest meant at the
Yeah,
beginning
of
of the
course,
century
يعني
is very different.
one big example is translations of the Quran, for instance. يعني you read Arbery and it sounds like the King James Bible, and you read Khalidi and you know it sounds like something else.
Amina, thank you.
Thank
very,
you.
very much.